everybody, welcome back. You're watching A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev and we're reading State of War, Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration. Remember, if you like the show, hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the notification bell so you're notified about future videos. Let's dig in. The Baathists relied heavily on foot soldiers and sympathy drawn from the disaffected Iraqi Sunni community, and without popular support in the so-called Sunni triangle of Iraq, the insurgency could not have been sustained. In late 2003, Bremer and the CPA finally recognized they had to reach out to the Sunnis and launched a so-called Sunni initiative to try to connect with Sunni leaders who might be willing to cooperate with the Americans. But by that time, Sunni leaders or other political figures who openly worked with the CPA were seen as collaborators and faced the threat of assassination by the insurgents. Within the Bush administration, no one wanted to suggest that the insurgency was at least in part a nationalistic rebellion fueled by Sunni anger and resentment. That would give it too much political credibility. The Pentagon was prepared to violate the cardinal rule of warfare, know thine enemy. It is no wonder that reports suggesting that conditions in Iraq were deteriorating were greeted in Washington as if they were partisan political attacks. Like the Pentagon, the CIA also failed to plan ahead. On the eve of battle, the CIA had little information to offer U.S. military commanders about what kind of political climate they could expect to find when they finally got to Baghdad. In the months before the invasion was launched, Lieutenant General David D. McKiernan, the commander of all land forces for the invasion, made an ominous admission to a senior CIA officer. He said that he was concerned about what was supposed to happen when the army got to Baghdad. He didn't know who the military was supposed to link up with once Saddam's regime was gone. The general wanted to know who was going to serve as the intermediary between the U.S. military and the Iraqis to make sure that things kept running in the country. Unfortunately, the CIA officer had to admit that the agency didn't have any answers. It didn't have any sources or agents in Baghdad who could help the Americans coordinate with local Iraqi leaders to keep the government running. In fact, no one at the CIA had even done any serious thinking about the problem. Instead of addressing pragmatic issues like those troubling General McKiernan, the CIA focused before the invasion on covert action programs, including expensive plans for the war that were never implemented. With a dash of bravado and a sense of hope, the CIA created a secret Iraqi paramilitary force and nicknamed it the Scorpions. I'm seeing like a bad 80s movie in my mind. Definitely got Sylvester Stallone in it. Training under the watchful eyes of U.S. Special Forces and CIA instructors at an isolated military base in the Jordanian desert, the Scorpions learned the black arts of covert action, deception, and sabotage. In late 2002 and early 2003, the CIA invested millions of dollars in the Scorpions to get them ready for a historic assignment to start a war. In many ways, the Scorpions, made up of Iraqi exiles, were the CIA's covert answer to the Pentagon's Free Iraqi Forces, a group of Iraqi exiles with ties to Chalabi, who had been trained in Hungary before the invasion. But in contrast to the Pentagon, the CIA took great pains to make sure that it kept Chalabi's influence out of the Scorpions, screening out those with ties to Chalabi and his organization. The CIA's plans for the Scorpions were ambitious, rooted in the agency's desire to play a leading role in the initial stages of the Iraq invasion. The CIA hoped to use the Scorpions at the outset of the war to conduct acts of sabotage inside Iraq, as well as for largely symbolic acts that could sow confusion within Saddam Hussein's regime. One proposed plan called for the Scorpions to be flown by helicopter across the border at the outset of the war and then dropped near an Iraqi military base. Dressed as Iraqi soldiers, they would stage a mutiny to make it seem as if the Iraqi army were beginning to rebel against Saddam Hussein. That action could also convince others in the Iraqi army to defect and join in the liberation of their country. The CIA's Directorate of Operations spent vast resources on the Scorpions. Despite skepticism among some in the CIA about the effectiveness of the operation. One CIA source described the group as a paramilitary fantasy that had no chance to have a significant impact on the course of the war. Ultimately, plans to use the Scorpions in the opening phase of the war were canceled, despite the investment, because of opposition from senior U.S. military commanders who believed the CIA-trained teams would only get in the way. Kurt Russell's in the movie too. Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone, they are the Scorpions. Without the Scorpions, the CIA's main role inside Iraq during the initial stages of the invasion came through joint teams set up with U.S. Special Forces to provide tactical intelligence support to the main invasion force as it moved toward Baghdad. These teams tried to develop local contacts in cities near the main invasion routes in order to scout out the opposition and potential points of resistance. Some of these teams did provide valuable information to the conventional military, particularly in southern Iraq. But thanks to weak planning and management controls at the agency, these teams were vulnerable to being misused, according to CIA sources. In fact, as the invasion progressed through southern Iraq, a case officer assigned to one of the special teams found himself wrestling with an order he believed was completely out of bounds, one that seemed to have echoes of Vietnam. According to a CIA source, while the young case officer was traveling with one of the teams, he received a call from another CIA official. The CIA officer told the young case officer to assign one of his Iraqi agents to eliminate a local Iraqi whom the agency believed was a problem. It was clear to the young case officer that the official was trying to get him to order the killing of the local Iraqi. In effect, the CIA official was trying to use the joint CIA Special Forces team as an assassination squad. That shows you the mentality of the people running this thing, said the CIA source. Instead, the case officer contacted a senior CIA official and told the senior officer about the order. The senior officer told him not to obey the order and not to order the killing. The young officer obeyed, and the killing did not take place. Yet the order for the killing of a local Iraqi has apparently never been investigated by the CIA, according to the agency source. In the days immediately after the fall of Baghdad in April, the CIA continued to conduct operations in Iraq without adequate planning or foresight, sometimes with tragic results. Eager to encourage the emergence of pro-American Muslim leaders in Iraq, the CIA arranged in early April 2003 for a moderate Shiite cleric, Abd al-Majid al-Kohi, to fly into Iraq from his exile in London. The cleric was not a CIA asset, but the agency believed he could be a stabilizing influence in the Shiite community. The decision to fly him into Iraq was made over the objections of CIA officers in the field, who warned that conditions in the country were still too dangerous. But the warnings were ignored, and on April 10, 2003, al-Kohi was murdered in Najaf almost as soon as he returned to Iraq. American officials suspected that radical Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr was behind the murder in order to eliminate a potential rival for clerical leadership. Some U.S. intelligence officials recognized before the invasion that the U.S. occupation of Iraq would present opportunities for new kinds of intelligence collection inside Iraq. In practice, however, many of those opportunities were squandered because of the lack of planning for the post-invasion period. American sources say, for example, that the National Security Agency had a plan to create a front company that would have managed cellular telephone service in post-war Iraq. That would have given the NSA the ability to eavesdrop on every cell phone call in the country and would have made it extremely difficult for insurgents to use electronic communications without being detected by American intelligence. But sources say that the NSA delayed its plans for so long that the CPA under Paul Bremer finally opened cell phone franchises to bidding by private companies. The CIA station chief who wrote the November 2003 Aardwolf that sparked so much controversy was actually the agency's second chief in post-war Baghdad. He took over in July 2003. A senior CIA officer had served as the first Baghdad station chief immediately after the invasion, but he only stayed in Iraq briefly, just long enough to get the CIA station up and running. Conditions were eroding so rapidly that by August, the second CIA station chief was already convinced that he needed to issue his first Aardwolf to warn Washington. The August report, written one day after a deadly bombing of the United Nations offices in Baghdad that killed the UN's top official in the country, was so grim that it immediately caused a stir within the CIA and the Bush administration, and even prompted a tart rebuttal from Bremer. The August Aardwolf said that the UN bombing was part of a strategy by a new and bold insurgency to discredit and isolate the US-led coalition, and warned that insurgents and terrorists had the capability to carry many more attacks against soft targets. The insurgency was increasingly dangerous and threatened to erase the early progress made by the Americans and could actually overwhelm occupation forces. It accurately identified two strands of violence coming from foreign mujahideen and Iraqi insurgents, and stated ominously that there was no shortage of combatants. It also predicted that the capture of Saddam Hussein was unlikely to end the insurgency, since he did not seem to be leading it. Coming so soon after the euphoria in Washington over the toppling of Saddam, the August Aardwolf seemed to many within the Bush administration to be far too negative. Bremer was so concerned by the tone of the Aardwolf that he felt compelled to write an accompanying note at the end of the report in which he downplayed its analysis of the worsening conditions in Iraq. He said it overestimated the threat posed by the insurgency, and he added that he did not think it was clear that this low-intensity conflict could erase American gains in Iraq, even if the rebellion grew worse. On balance, he said, reconstruction in Iraq was going forward despite the insurgency. As the violence continued to worsen in the summer and fall of 2003, there was increasing tension within the Bush administration over the best ways to respond. A major issue was how best to focus intelligence resources to help identify and capture or kill insurgents. The problem was that the CIA was stretched thin. For political reasons, the White House wanted the CIA to conduct the hunt for Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. The Pentagon's initial weapons of mass destruction hunting efforts had been so amateurish that President Bush had personally asked CIA Director George Tenet to take over the task, and it sounds like he wasn't the guy anyway. Tenet had asked former UN weapons inspector David Kay to lead a new team, the Iraq Survey Group, to scour the countryside looking for any evidence of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. By the fall, Kay's team had hit a series of dry holes. Meanwhile, the insurgency was worsening, and so the CIA station in Baghdad began pushing for a shift of intelligence resources away from the hunt for weapons of mass destruction and toward efforts to counter the insurgency. U.S. military commanders were also pushing for a redeployment of the Iraq Survey Group to counter insurgency work. Tenet agreed to redeploy some of the Iraq Survey Group, and he still pushed for the CIA's Baghdad station to keep hunting for weapons of mass destruction, and that led to tensions between Baghdad and CIA headquarters. CIA officers in Baghdad thought that headquarters was forcing them to continue a wild goose chase. In January 2004, just as David Kay went public with his belief that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, a CIA manager gave the staff of the Baghdad station an unusual deadline. Tenet was being forced to retestify before Congress about the hunt for weapons of mass destruction. Did I say retestify? Just testify. Tenet was being forced to testify before Congress about the hunt for weapons of mass destruction, and the director had to explain to lawmakers why nothing had been found. David Kay was making life uncomfortable for Tenet, and he didn't want to have to walk into the hearing room empty-handed. So the CIA manager at headquarters told the Baghdad station staff to launch a new last gasp effort to find some weapons of mass destruction. The director is on the Hill in 7 days. Let's refocus on finding the WMD, the official said. Unfortunately, Baghdad station could not find any weapons to appease Tenet. The tension between the political demands for WMD and the more pressing need to fight an increasingly deadly insurgency was one of several underlying themes behind a series of constant battles between the Baghdad station and the CIA headquarters over resources and manpower in the first year after the invasion. One of the most pressing problems was a shortage of CIA officers in the Baghdad station who could speak Arabic. The CIA was flooding Iraq with officers on temporary assignments drawn from all over the world, but few had experience in the Arab world, and even fewer could speak Arabic. Many were rookie officers on their first overseas tour of duty. By the fall of 2003, the station had just 4 case officers who could speak the language, making it extremely difficult for many of the officers at the station to conduct clandestine operations effectively in the country. There was also a shortage of analysts who could improve the agency's understanding of the insurgency. CIA analysts sitting back in Langley couldn't get a feel for the rapidly changing nature of the rebellion, and the Baghdad station began pushing CIA headquarters to send analysts to Iraq who could help make some sense of reports coming in from the field. Finally, by the end of 2003, the CIA had about 30 intelligence analysts deployed to Baghdad. More than 9 months after the invasion, they began to unlock elusive clues from the intelligence that allowed them to begin to map the structure of the insurgency. Ever since the summer of 2003, the Baghdad station had realized that one of the biggest mistakes being made in Iraq was the failure to conduct a systematic effort to obtain intelligence from Iraqi insurgents who had been captured. The U.S. military was doing a poor job of identifying and questioning important detainees. It didn't even know how many foreign fighters it was holding among the thousands of detainees in its prisons. The CIA agreed to take on the job of interrogating the most important detainees to gather intelligence on the insurgency. But CIA headquarters refused to give the Baghdad station the resources or the legal guidelines it needed to do the job effectively and within the limits of U.S. law. The Baghdad station's leaders repeatedly asked Langley to provide its case officers with training to interrogation methods to make certain that they were conducting the sessions with the prisoners in the proper manner. But CIA headquarters failed to provide the training. As early as July 2003, the station asked CIA headquarters for written guidelines on how to conduct detainee interrogations. CIA headquarters wouldn't provide them, leading to heated arguments. After months of frustrating delays, tensions erupted during one secure video conference call between Baghdad and Langley, where the deputy station chief in Baghdad started yelling at headquarters staffers, demanding that they provide the written guidelines for interrogations that the station had requested. The only response came from the Near East Division chief, who told the Baghdad station chief that his deputy was becoming too strident on the issue. The guidelines were never delivered before the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal erupted. CIA headquarters also initially failed to provide Baghdad with a lawyer to handle legal questions related to the conduct of prisoner interrogations. Excuse me. Instead, the station had to search for legal advice on an informal basis from other CIA or military lawyers who happened to be passing through Baghdad. The agency didn't send a lawyer to Baghdad to deal with the legal aspects of detainee interrogations until January 2004, and then only after the Army had begun its internal investigation of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib. For the Baghdad station, the most sensitive issue related to detainee interrogations involved ghost detainees, prisoners who were not immediately registered in military prisons while they were questioned by the CIA. Another controversial practice involved the movement of some ghost detainees out of Iraq. During 2003, there were 6 to 8 people captured in Iraq who were taken by the CIA to be interrogated to other countries, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. Sources say that ghosting, including the practice of transporting some prisoners to other nations, was improved by senior CIA officials, and only later did they order that the detainees be quietly shipped back to Iraq when they realized that the practice could be in violation of the Geneva Conventions. According to a report in the Washington Post, the Justice Department went so far as to draft a memo authorizing the CIA to move detainees out of Iraq for interrogation. While CIA headquarters was deaf to requests from the Baghdad station for more help with interrogations, no one in Washington ignored the station chief's grim second Aardwolf in November, entitled "The Expanding Insurgency in Iraq." Its political implications were hard to miss. As of early November 2003, the Aardwolf explained the insurgency in central and northern Iraq was gaining momentum and beginning to tip the balance against the Americans. The insurgents were self-confident and believed they will ultimately succeed in returning to power as they have in the past. The rebels could sense that American political will was wavering and felt very little pressure from American military operations. They were more agile than the U.S. military, the report warned, while politically they were taking advantage of the fact that the United States had not developed a clear message that was resonating with the Iraqi people. As a result, Iraqis realized that the Baathists were still powerful despite the ouster of Saddam Hussein. In the Sunni heartland, the Baathists appeared largely unchallenged, yet at the same time the Iraqis perceived political drift in Baghdad. The Americans, the report suggested, had blown their best chance to stabilize Iraq. The Iraqi regime had been surprised by the speed with which the Americans won the war, the report said, and so the Baathists had been off balance in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Baghdad, and they had melted away into the Sunni heartland. But it was now clear, the report said, that the regime had not been decisively defeated, but rather only dispersed. And the failure of the Americans to establish a firm grip on the country gave them an opportunity to make a comeback. By the end of the summer, the continued sense of isolation in the Sunni heartland, the complete dissolution of the army and other institutions of security, rigid de-Baathification, and the lack of economic opportunities or political direction gave these regime elements the confidence they needed to repair their networks and reestablish themselves. The ease with which the insurgents move and exist in Baghdad and the Sunni heartland is bolstering their self-confidence further. Top CIA officials initially praised the November Aardwolf, and one told the Baghdad station chief that it was the best Aardwolf he had ever read. The Aardwolf clearly caught the attention of the White House and the Pentagon. In early December, the station chief was asked to brief President Bush. But as noted, the high-level attention was a double-edged sword, and the station chief was now completely off message. Senior U.S. military officers in Baghdad bitterly complained that they had been blindsided by the Aardwolf, and tensions grew between the CIA and the Pentagon. Just days after the station chief briefed Bush, he was told that he would not be going back to Baghdad. By 2005, the CIA station chief's November 2003 Aardwolf would seem prescient. After the chief was pulled out of Baghdad, the insurgency only got worse and American casualties soared. Iraqi's Sunni population still felt alienated from the new political process, which was dominated by the Shiites and the Kurds. Iraq became a magnet for foreign jihadists, providing a new breeding ground for Al-Qaeda. Islamic extremists, primarily Sunnis, who came to Iraq to fight the Americans were becoming battle-hardened. Today, Iraq is the Super Bowl for jihadists, said one American intelligence official. The connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda was finally complete. Thanks for joining me. Hit the like and subscribe button if you would. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks.